you. Now let's begin. Ms. Schulte is still not here, but in the order of the ballot, Mr. Connolly will do his opening statement. He is the Democratic candidate.
Thank you, Olga. Good evening. It's great to be back at Westminster. This is my 7th event here, including 5 town hall meetings I've held here, including one that was covered rather extensively in the front page of the Washington Post just a year ago. You know, I believe if you're going to ask to represent people, you got to show up. This can't be the first time you step foot in a community. You've got to have credentials. And I think I've earned my credentials. The first thing I did after being elected to this job was to reopen a Prince William County district office and to make sure it had full-time staffing after it had been closed for a number of years. When Holly Acres was flooded, I was the first to rush down to try to help the victims and make sure they had shelter and food and clothing and toys for the kids and more transient housing besides just staying in a high school gymnasium. I donated thousands of dollars to replace the Boys and Girls Club's computers in their computer lab. I worked with a fraternity to make sure that people had the right to vote in 2012. When River Oaks had 4- and 5-hour line waits, we made sure they had blankets, they had water, kids had some attention, and they could move inside to stay warm and exercise their most sacred right. I've worked to open Featherstone National Park. Featherstone has been closed here in Prince William for 40 years. I am the one who has worked with the Fish and Wildlife Fund and with the association and with CSX and VRE to open that up, and I got a few $100,000 of federal money. With stimulus money, I got improvements to the Prince William County Parkway to 29 and 66, and we saved 304 teachers' jobs here in Prince William County. I've been there. Throughout my career, I've worked on a bipartisan basis to be there, and that's how we just opened the Silver Line in the Dulles Corridor, one of the most important transportation investments in Northern Virginia. And I want to make sure we look at those options for here in Prince William County. I've introduced a bill, and I'm very pleased the Prince William Chamber of Commerce has endorsed that bill to study the feasibility of extending Metro several different lines here into Prince William County. If we don't start studying that now, if we don't look at the feasibility of that now, we will drown in traffic 20 years now. Drown in it. We've got to look at other options. That's called leadership. I've been there for Prince William County. This isn't my first time at Westminster. This isn't my first time in this community. And I hope with your support, if I am reelected, I'll continue to be there for Prince William County. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. God bless.
Next is Mr. Galdo, the Green Party candidate.
Good evening. Thank you for being here. And thanks to the League of Women Voters and the other organizers for making this meet and greet possible. My name again is Joe Galdo. I am the Green Party candidate for Congress here in the 11th Congressional District. I spent half my career evaluating threats and assessing military system capabilities and vulnerabilities, developing skills and experience to prepare me to ask the right questions, not only about R&D investment and military system acquisition, but also in vetting responses to security risks around the world. At the Department of Energy, I led national efforts to establish green power programs at utilities across the country. I also led the development of regulatory reforms and technical standards that are now incorporated in net metering laws in states across the nation, including here in Virginia. These were key to the growth renewable energy has seen in the past decade and the creation of green jobs. These were key to the growth my experience in developing strategies to address global warming and develop technology roadmaps will aid in creating better policies to achieve our energy and environmental goals. I believe public policy should be formulated based on its impact on the average American, not on corporate profits or increasing the wealth of a few. I have a tax reform plan that will simplify the tax code and eliminate corporate welfare. It will raise more than $400 billion in additional revenue to support needed investments in infrastructure, energy, education, and public health and safety without raising taxes for the average taxpayer. I believe we should be investing in the future instead of the past. So if elected, I will introduce a 10-year plan to generate at least 40% of our electricity from renewable energy and replace one-half of the petroleum-fueled cars on the road today with electric vehicles and free ourselves from Middle East oil. I will work to reverse the increasing violations of privacy, due process, and the rule of law. I will promote honesty and transparency in government. I'm running to give voters a choice. If you're tired of the status quo, that is public policy driven by money, and want real change, I promise I will do my best to get the job done. Sometimes we think about local issues, but a lot of times the money's not there to solve the problem, like money for the Silver Line or money for extensions down to Prince William County that we might talk about. Our education budgets are being squeezed. And this is due to problems up at the federal government, okay? That the economy's not doing well, tax revenues are down, and so in order to address local issues properly, you really have to start to think nationally in terms of national problems. Foreign interventions that cost $2 trillion that could have been spent for investing in the future, money wasted, okay? And that's where I'm coming from. And I see a lot of Connolly signs out there, but there are enough individuals that seem to be undecided that I would love to have your vote. Thank you.
Mr. Mark Harold is the Libertarian candidate.
Thank you very much. I am Mark Harold. I'm the Libertarian Party nominee, obviously for the Virginia 11th. A little bit about my background. I know we'll get to the issues. My background is I'm a former City of Atlanta police officer, and I was a drug task force officer in not the earliest days, but some of the early days of the drug war in the City of Atlanta. I'm a former law professor, having served with the Department of Justice Research Center and taught law at the University of Mississippi. And I mainly focus my research on both on First Amendment law, but also on Fourth Amendment law as it applies, search and seizure law as it applies to digital devices. And during that time, I became very concerned about the way that our Fourth Amendment and our search and seizure laws are protecting us from mass surveillance. I spent 5 years with the Department of Homeland Security as a policy advisor and a prosecutor with Immigration and Customs Enforcement. I now run a small business, a law firm, a solo practice, pretty much just like my campaign sometimes. It's just total solo practice. I have no staff, I have no associates, and I do immigration law. What I do every day now, and I used to prosecute, I've seen both sides of it, is I go into court and protect people who are facing deportation proceedings. I've seen the inequity of our immigration system, the complexity of our immigration system, that I assure you, even the most seasoned attorneys, and I've been doing it about 13 years overall, cannot understand our immigration system. It's sort of like tax. It's dense, it's regulatory, and in the confusion, individuals who have merit to come here and have claims to come here are unrepresented. And they show up in immigration court alone, and they're not able to avail themselves of the legal relief that they deserve. I'm stressing in my campaign liberty, simplicity, and transparency. Those are sort of the three ways that I would see every decision that I would make. Is it simple? Is it transparent? Does it promote liberty? I think if we're going to talk about different issues, but my approach is basically on any issue, is first, should the government be involved at all? Should any government be involved? I'm running for federal office, so the second question, or the question I would always ask is, should the federal government be involved? Sometimes people come up to me and they'll say, just in a very blanket way, are you for or against this issue? And I give an answer that pretty much says the federal government should stay out of it, and then I read later, or somebody tells me later, that I'm against that issue. I'm not against the issue. I believe in a very limited federal role. The federal government can really only do what the Constitution says it can. And this is general, of course. The states can do pretty much anything unless the Constitution says that they can't. And that's basically how I would go about my job as your congressman. I would look to say, should the government be involved? Is the federal government playing a proper constitutional role? And then, of course, I'd go to, can we afford it? I do a cost-benefit analysis. I believe we need to leave our children and grandchildren limited government, not unlimited debt. And I think we're down a path that's going to take us to unlimited debt, that's going to cripple the prosperity of this country. See, my time's almost up. I always forget to do this. If I earn your vote, I'd like to ask for your vote. Thank you very much.
Ms. Suzanne Schulte, the Republican candidate.
Thank you very much. I want to express my appreciation to the League of Women Voters and the AARP and the Coalition for Asian Pacific Association for hosting this. As a challenger candidate, we love these opportunities to be able to visit with folks. It's true, I have not been here before. I've never run for office before. I'm not a politician. I have been running a foundation called the Defense Forum Foundation. It's a nonpartisan foundation that does programs on Capitol Hill on defense, foreign affairs, and human rights issues. It's basically an opportunity to bring Republicans and Democrats together to talk about issues that we can work on together to preserve America. And through that work, I got very involved in also promoting freedom, democracy, and human rights abroad, because all the countries that are a threat to the United States are without exception a threat to their own people. So I became very involved in working in, especially in Asia and in North Africa, in promoting freedom and human rights for people in different countries. And as a result of my work, I got involved rescuing women that were victims of trafficking that were escaping from North Korea, refugees in North Africa. And as a result of those efforts, won the Seoul Peace Prize, the Sanders Peace and Social Justice Award, the Walter J. Freedom Award, and most recently an award from President Obama for volunteerism. The reason why I decided to run for Congress, though, is I'm really concerned about the brokenness in Washington. I feel that our elected officials aren't only not listening, not only not hearing us, they're not even bothering to listen to us. I feel that the intransigence in Washington, and I blame both parties for that, is why we're having a lot of the very serious problems that we're having here today. And I decided to run for Congress. I would be very honored to be your servant as somebody who has a record of bringing people together. I've actually passed legislation, worked to pass legislation, working with Democrats and Republicans. I am running as Republican, but I've actually had Democrats publicly endorse me because of my passion and work. And I would love to have your support. I look forward to your questions. And thank you again for giving us this opportunity.
Okay, I now ask you to hold your applause to the end so that we can get as many questions in as possible. Thank you. And I'm going to begin with Ms. Schulte. Assume the Affordable Care Act is here to stay. What one thing needs to be changed to make it better?
The first, I would support the legislation that was recently passed by the Congress. It was nonpartisan for people to be able to keep their health care plans. But I do think that the Affordable Care Act is a classic example of the inability for people to work together. This is a major social change in policy. We've never had something like this, a major change like this, whether it was welfare reform, Social Security reform, where the parties didn't work together for a solution. And that's why it's been such a disaster. It had bipartisan opposition, but only one party voted for it. And I think that's why we're seeing the terrible ramifications of this. All the promises that were made about it have been broken. People's premiums are going up. This was supposed to be about getting the insured access to affordable care. This is what was supposed to be, getting those that were uninsured insured. That's what the American people wanted. They didn't want the whole system upended, and it's been a disaster. And again, it's an example of not working together to solve problems that for the Americans and for Northern Virginians. And the person I'm running against voted for this, and I think it was a terrible vote.
Mr. Connolly?
Well, I couldn't disagree more with my opponent. I am proud of having voted for the Affordable Care Act. It is transforming lives in America as we speak. 7.3 million people who were uninsured are now insured. Another 3 million people are accessing Medicaid. And there'd be 400,000 more of them here in Virginia if my opponent's party would only stop blocking that expansion down in Richmond. In terms of seniors, seniors have seen the donut hole close by hundreds of dollars, making drugs more affordable. You can now go once a year to your doctor with no copayment for a checkup. You can have preventive care. We've expanded the life of Medicare. We've expanded Medicare Advantage. Republican critics said we were going to kill Medicare Advantage. So what happened? For the first time in the history of the program, premiums went down. Benefits went up, and enrollment skyrocketed. Other than that, my opponent is right. It was a disaster.
Mr. Galvin?
The Affordable Care Act is a step in the right direction, but it's not perfect. I know from personal experience because my son is learning disabled and he lost his job because of his autism as well. And he was working for a federal contractor, and there were changes of personnel in the agency that he was working at, the federal agency, and they just couldn't tolerate and couldn't accommodate some of his difficulties. Now, I applied for health insurance through healthcare.gov, and I'll tell you, it was a real mess. I had to do it by phone because it wouldn't let me get into the system to actually make a choice. I think if I had, well, and I also found that if my son hadn't had savings, he didn't qualify for Medicaid, and he would not be able to afford the co-pays and the other expenses that you have to pay for the medical care that he would receive on even the partial salary that he received before he was laid off. Now, if I had one thing to change with the Affordable Care Act, I would change it to a single-payer plan and put it under Medicare, rather than going through insurance companies, increasing the cost and the complexity of the system. Simplify it, lower the costs. If I had a second thing to do, I would expand our public clinic network and increase the number of doctors and particularly nurses that are in the system. We have a public health service and a national medical service that provides scholarships to doctors and nurses when they join the health service. Okay, we should do more of that and provide health care directly to people who cannot afford health insurance even through Medicare. Okay, and that would serve to lower the costs both to individuals and to the taxpayer. And I think those are the two main things I would do. Thank you.
Mr. Harold? Same question.
Well, I think this is one of those things that's a good example of, if you torture statistics long enough, they'll tell you anything you want to hear. When I try to do research on what this act is actually doing, what it's accomplishing, what's not there, what continuities have been established that you're allowed to keep, what you're not allowed to keep, it's very confusing. The one thing that I'm doing, and this is assuming it's the law of the land, all right? There's a couple things to that. First of all, I would vote to repeal what we're calling Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act. I think it's a leap in the wrong direction in that, and we're all pretty far apart on this, at least in some ways. I believe it is a step towards a single-payer system. I believe that's exactly what it is, and that's the road we're heading down. Obviously, if you favor single-payer, I believe you will see it as an intermediate step. I don't think there's a real way to favor Obamacare or Affordable Care Act without realizing that it's that slippery slope towards single-payer. So a lot of it has to do with how you feel about single-payer. I think it's a huge encroachment on a major portion of the economy, probably about 1/7 of the economy, in different estimates that you see. I just think it's absolutely an umbrella government program. I worry about, as the drug war comes to an end, I think we will see expansions in other law enforcement agencies. I think the two that we'll see the most of are going to be in the EPA and the IRS. And the IRS is going to come to have so much data from Obamacare. And once they merge all of this up, I know it sounds sometimes Orwellian, but you have to remember it's not what these systems and all this data was proposed to do. It's what it can do. And I see that a law enforcement entity of the IRS, as we've seen with some of the IRS, the problems with the IRS, basically putting them in charge of this with that information. It's not over a takeover of the economy, it's a takeover of information. But I think it's a step in the wrong direction. I know this is a contentious issue. I wouldn't, if I was going to leave one thing, I would try to make it more transparent, but I would vote to repeal Obamacare or Affordable Care Act if I was given the chance to cast that vote. Thanks.
Thank you. Next question. You may have seen the telecommuting bill. How can you depend that after the GAO report shows tremendous amounts of waste and fraud, what would you do to compensate for massive amounts of waste in government? Ms. Schulte? Yes, we're just going round and round.
Oh, okay. Well, first of all, I think we need to reward government employees for identifying places of fraud and abuse. I think it's really, there's something that's going on in our country when we have someone like Edward Snowden who feels like he can't go to somebody to say that our government's doing something that's wrong, and he ends up fleeing the country. Or you have a Secret Service agent that can't go to a superior and say, yes, there was a shot that was fired that went through the window of the White House. There's something really wrong in our government when people that are working for our government can't go to a superior to talk about a serious problem that's happening. And I think that we need to establish a reward system to reward federal employees that identify places where there is waste and fraud and abuse. And I know that there's a report that just came out in December by Senator Coburn that identified $30 billion of wasteful programs. And these are the types of things that American taxpayers get very upset when they see. And I think we need to make the federal government employees be kind of allies in trying to weed out this kind of abuse.
Mr. Connell? This was specifically to telecommuting.
Yeah, I thought the question had to do with telecommuting and the GAO report that found that at least one federal agency was cheating on its reports on teleworking. Teleworking has enormous benefits, and I'm proud to have co-authored a bipartisan bill signed into law by the President, the Telework Enhancement Act, which is designed to try to incentivize and promote more teleworking by our federal employees. Here in Prince William County, if we're not going to have transit anytime soon, I assure you, telework is a very important tool for us. And we already employ it, we need to expand it. But we also need to have rigorous standards of enforcement to make sure people are abiding by the rules. And the rules in telework are very clear. You have to have a set-aside time, you have to have set-aside equipment, you got to have a set-aside room, and you got to be reporting regularly, obviously, to your supervisor. When I was chairman of that neighboring county, I set a goal of 20% of our employees teleworking by the year 25, and eligible workers. We not only met that goal, we exceeded it, and to this day, telework is enhancing productivity, enhancing morale, making it easier to recruit and retain the employees of the future. In the federal government, if you talk to young people, if you look around the room here with young people, younger than me, they eat and breathe technology. They grew up with it. They expect telework to be part of the program. 47% of all federal employees are eligible for retirement this decade. If we're going to replace them and retain their replacements, telework and that use of technology, versatility of technology, is critical to the success of the mission. So I'm a big fan of telework, but it's got to be monitored and it's got to be managed. Thank you.
Mr. Galdo?
I can't add much to what Mr. Connolly has said. When I worked at DOE, I did not telecommute, but I had a number of coworkers who did. And I have to tell you that most of the people that I worked with in government were honest and dedicated. And first of all, you have to trust people. Second, it did boost their morale, and it enabled them to do work that they might not have been able to do because of other responsibilities they had, because of the distance they were commuting. And so, you know, it's a really good program, but the problems that you have with it are really management problems, and being able to assign the type of work while they're telecommuting that can be audited properly, and having management that's responsible for doing that, and holding management accountable for it. And that also means having oversight from layers above direct supervisors and getting GAO or the Inspector Generals involved just to set up an audit program and review them every once in a while.
Mr. Harold?
Yeah, I don't think there's going to be a ton of disagreement on this. I favor telework. I was at Department of Homeland Security at ICE when telework sort of started to become implemented. Now, I was a litigator, so I really pushed for telework to be able to call into court and just kind of telephonically show up and object from my house. But, you know, I think I completely agree. First of all, the people that I worked with, I think a lot of the fraud or the waste that we're seeing is just that some of the metrics aren't there yet, some of the management and accountabilities, it's, you know, everything doesn't happen at once. And I find, too, that most of my colleagues, and I still have close relationships with former colleagues and a lot of close friends at all levels of government. I've worked state, local, and federal government. They are honest people doing, in many cases, a tough job under pressure and a lot of criticism. But, you know, I found that the same people that were causing waste and fraud, you know, in the brick and mortar world, when they were in the office, were pretty much the ones taking advantage of telework. So I think it does all come down to management. It's just a different task for the managers, but accountability and management, how you're going to assign the work and all. If you have good management there in the office, you'll have good management there in telework after the growing pains get worked out. But I'm a favor of telework. Like I said, I couldn't really take advantage of it. We did have a meeting, and we were all litigators, so we did kind of try to figure out how this would work on telework. You know, I kind of wanted 2 days of telework in my AWS day to kind of roll right through. I could do a trial from my house, but it never happened. But it is one of those things. It's going to take some growing pains, but on this, I think it all comes down to management. The management and accountability and leadership and development of leaders in the government will translate from the office to telework, and I think that leadership and management's always the answer when it comes down to accountability and decreasing waste and fraud.
I think most of us would agree we'd like to see more lawyers telework.
The next question goes to Mr. Connolly. What, if elected or re-elected, do you think is the one most important thing that could be dealt with and bring more civility to Congress?
That's a really good question. I have looked for common ground when I've been in 6 years now in Congress, and I certainly did in local government as well. In fact, in local government, we really didn't have partisan votes, certainly not when I was chairman for 5 years. I worked across the aisle, and I still do. I've tried to get a Republican co-sponsor for every one of the 36 bills I've introduced in Congress. I've worked with my colleagues here in the Virginia delegation. Just today, we had a hearing with my friend John Mike, a Republican of Florida, on government waste. So there are lots of opportunities for common ground. I think it's much more difficult on the big things because, frankly, we do have philosophical disagreements. We don't see the world the same way, and we have to work extra hard at trying to come together nonetheless and see if we can't reconcile those views for the common good. That has been a very difficult thing for the last 2 Congresses. That may be one reason why this Congress is the least productive in recorded history. Very little got done. Big issues loom in front of us. And I don't know that I could just say one, but I want to see comprehensive immigration reform in America. The system is broken, and we need it from top to bottom. Not just border security, but that too. But we need higher-end skill sets in the H-1B1 visa program. We need to be able to help families who want to reunite or have an event here and bring a loved one from the old country here. Very difficult to do. We need comprehensive tax reform to make the tax system fairer, more transparent, and simpler. I'd start with those 2 big things. If we can get those done, we can get almost anything done for America.
Mr. Galdo?
I think the real solution to this problem is up to the voters, because the root cause of partisan politics is the 2-party system and a politics of fear, where each party says, no, you have to vote for me because the other party is so bad. And they create this environment where there's a toxicity between the 2 major parties. I think the best thing that voters could do would be to vote for more third-party candidates like Libertarians and Green Party candidates, and mix up, the content of the Congress so that you don't have one party against the other, and you work more in a mode of building coalitions and working together. And from my perspective, that's where I see the solution.
Mr. Harrell?
Well, just be nice, just go out and be nice. No, I agree. I think when you look back at the history and you talk about the Federalist Papers, and you go back, if you're a fan of that sort of thing, and talk about what factions really are and what oligarchy really are, I really think that the 2-party duopoly is harmful. And it's not that all the people in it are harmful. It's just that when you have a plurality voting system instead of instant runoff or some other system, I mean, nothing in the Constitution says how we have to vote. But when you have top 2, in other words, how many people in here have gone to the polls and voted more against somebody than for them? I think a lot of people have done that. You go in and you look at two people, and maybe you don't really crazy about either one of them, but because of the way you do with top-down voting, with plurality voting, a lot of times you vote against somebody as much as for them. So I think that more third-party candidates, more independents, getting into the mix will help. Obviously, once these people, start getting elected, you can't do as much as a candidate as you can as a congressman. But the voters really need to stop rewarding the incivility. I mean, it all comes down to it's a consumer-driven thing. If people find that time and time again, I lived down in Mississippi for years. I've moved around a lot. And I lived down in Mississippi for years, and I have a friend that ran for mayor of a medium-sized Mississippi town. And he was a good guy, and he was way behind. And at the last minute, the national or state party, I can't remember, not locals, came into this town and did this real negative ad against him. And it was brutal. And nobody endorsed it locally. It came in some mailers or something like that. My friend ended up winning because time and time again at the exit polls, everybody came out and they said, well, I don't agree with him on everything, but that was just an ugly thing to say about him. It was just ugly. And if you've lived down south a lot, you know what they're talking about. I think that the voters need to stop rewarding this divisiveness and start rewarding civility and force their representatives to act in a certain way. I think it is unfortunate when especially young people see our political process that is so antagonistic, and I don't think that it has to be. Thanks.
Ms. Schulte?
Okay, my priorities, the reason why I'm running, first of all, I do think the Affordable Care Act has not lived up to what we were promised. People are losing their insurance. We have 250,000 cancellations of policies in Virginia. We have people not being able to keep their doctors. This is what I'm hearing, and I'm out there every day trying to talk to voters directly and find out what their concerns are. And there are a lot of concerns, and we can't ignore this and pretend that this has just been a perfect bill. It's not. There's a lot of people that are hurting. A lot of people have lost their insurance, and premiums are going up for many people, and we're not signing up the people that we're supposed to be getting covered. So we need to step back and work to come up with reforms that will help make insurance affordable and give people access to it. And what's going on now is it's not doing what they promised, not doing what President Obama promised, not doing what Congressman Connolly promised. It's been a complete failure. And this is what I'm hearing everywhere I go. So the first priority would be to come up with fixes to fix some of the problems that have been created by the Affordable Care Act. And ultimately, it's up to us. We should be able to have control over what kind of insurance plans we want. This is a program where the government and insurers are picking the plans for us and telling us what is best for us. We ought to be able to have more choice on the kind of plans we want, not a government control over the healthcare industry. So it's been a huge disaster. But the other thing, too, that I'm hearing from a lot of folks is what happened with sequester. Another example of my opponent voted for the sequester, which was devastating for Northern Virginia. This was a vote because he wanted to support his party, not the people of Northern Virginia. And I would work to repeal the cuts that were made from the sequester, which is something that it's a nonpartisan issue. Democrats are recognizing that too. We cannot currently meet our national security goals right now. Michelle Fournier, Undersecretary for Defense for Policy for Obama, said the same thing.
Okay, next question. How would you protect Social Security for today and for today's seniors and strengthen it for future generations? Aldo?
The answer is simple, okay? Two ways you can do that. One is lift the ceiling on Social Security taxes, okay? On the ceiling on wages for Social Security taxes. I mean, that would create a huge additional revenue for the Social Security trust fund. Second is create more jobs. Because the more people you have working, the more people you have paying into Social Security, and that's our problem now. And it's not the unemployment rate. You have to look at the employment rate. And the employment rate for workers from 24 to 55 years of age, that is, we're ignoring retirees, ignoring students. The core of the working population has been decreasing for the last 30 years. Okay? It's a fundamental problem with our economy, and it's because our economic policies are wrong. Okay? Instead of putting money into the hands of corporations and voting for more tax breaks for wealthy investors, we should be eliminating all of those tax breaks for the wealthy and for corporations and putting more money into infrastructure and green energy and other activities that will create jobs for people. Thank you.
Mr. Hill? You can pop up right after he finishes.
Oh, we're going in, okay, all right. All right, a little slow on the uptake on that one. I think that we have to have entitlement reform. I don't think the numbers bear out. Now, I do believe that we have to keep the promises that we've made when people have paid into a system. I don't think you can have a transparent government if it's a government that doesn't keep its promises. I do think, and there's so many different types of plans, I do think we have to move to where there is ownership over that money to some degree. It's not necessarily where you pay into it into that lockbox, it's continually rated. I think we have to have a 6.2 plan. I think we have to have some mechanism where you have options to put that money into more private programs if you choose to. And over time, it gives you ownership into that money. The big fallacy, I think, is that Social Security is so secure that it's never going to be insolvent. I don't believe that's true. First of all, we've seen the quote-unquote lockbox rated at different times for different reasons, but workers, when they part with their money, they should have some ownership. They should have an option to have ownership of that money and more control of that money instead of just putting it into a system. But that being said, after the promises are kept, I don't think we can say, especially with technological and medical advances, that we're going to be able to keep the retirement age exactly where it is. Just the actuary, tables, everything else will tell you, at some point, you have to have more people paying in or people paying in for longer, or it just can't sustain. So I do believe we both need reform to military spending and entitlement reform. I don't have any quick plan to fix Social Security in perpetuity, but I do believe that at some point you have to give the workers who have paid into it some ownership and some decision-making power over portions of that money and find a way that that lockbox that we're talking about cannot be rated for any other use, because the transparency, predictability will lead it to being a program that can sustain. I believe we need major overhaul with it, but I do believe we need to keep the promises of people who've already paid into it, because I believe keeping promises is a big part of getting government trust back and transparency.
I would, first of all, enact some of the recommendations that came from the commission that President Obama appointed, the Simpson-Bowles Commission. One of the recommendations they had was to increase the retirement age, which is something that Mark had mentioned. And I also, I support that for future, for people that are entering the workforce in the future, not for people in the system now. You can't change the rules for the people that are in the system now, but for future people that are in the system, we need to start raising the retirement age because people are living longer, people want to work longer, and that's just a practicality. And then what Joe made an excellent point, and that is we've got to get more people back to work. We're at a tipping point right now. We're at a tipping point in the sense that we have more people that are dependent on the government than are working. And we've got to change that by getting more people back to work, because we've got to meet the obligations that we've made for people that have paid into the Social Security system. That money belongs to them, and they're counting on that benefit. So we need to get more people working, and the way to do that is to repeal the cuts that were made by the sequester that are damaging our national security and have been disproportionately unfair to Northern Virginia. We need to reform the health care, because a lot of people, when I go out there and talk to folks, people aren't hiring, people aren't starting new businesses because they're really worried how they're going to be able to pay for insurance for their employees. We need to simplify the tax code. One of the things that the congressman mentioned, we absolutely need to simplify our tax code. We haven't had a simplification and a reform of our tax code since 1986. That's another way that we can to be able to begin to create more jobs by reducing taxes and getting rid of all these regulations. We need regulatory reform desperately as well.
Mr. Connolly?
Well, I thought we were talking about Social Security. Sequestration does not affect Social Security. Sequestration is... Sequestration, as a matter of fact, specifically exempts Social Security. However, sequestration is an evil thing. I opposed it. I don't know what my opponent is talking about. You can look up the record. In fact, last year I was the only one of Northern Virginia's congressmen to vote against the continuing resolution to fund the government because I said it baked in sequestration. You can look it up. It was covered quite well by the Prince William County Press in Inside Innova, and would be glad to provide copies of that. I've led the effort against sequestration, working with corporate citizens, working with individual citizens in Northern Virginia. There are no kind words to describe it, so I won't describe it. It is not true. Social Security. You know, getting rid of regulation doesn't have anything to do with Social Security. What has something to do with Social Security is making sure long-term it's solvent. Let's start with the fact that something we know here in Westminster, because at our last town hall meeting here, we actually heard about this. Social Security is solvent. It's not insolvent. It doesn't contribute one dime to the national debt. In fact, it funds the deficit. We're borrowing against Social Security. We owe Social Security Trust Fund trillions of dollars. Long term, the single best thing we could do, and you add 40, 50, 60 years to it, is frankly what Joe Galdo said. Why do we have this artificial cap on the withholding tax? So that only $117,000 of your income is taxed for Social Security. Now, we don't have to lift it 100%, but certainly we can do better than that so that the Bill Gates of the world help fund their fair share of Social Security, and that extends Social Security's lifespan for another half century.
Thank you. The Supreme Court eliminated Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, so the formula that determines if new election laws, Section 5, I'm sorry. I'm reading as it was written. That determined new election laws needed to be submitted for pre-clearance. What proposals would you support to prevent voting laws that discriminate against certain voters? Mr. Howard?
I read this case. It's dense. There's no express constitutional right to vote, but we do know, because we've provided gender and age protections, that it is without a doubt a fundamental right. Specifically, this was a large case. It was mostly about federalism. It had to do with the federal government and how they were going to treat certain historically problematic states, and I was living in one at the time. The problem with the opinion, it was the scope of it and the way that it was set down. I don't have time to go into all that. I would certainly support legislation if it was... See, the Section 5 is problematic because if you've read it, I don't want to get too wonky, but it has some backward parts to it. But I'll just say this. Voting is a fundamental right. Anything that inhibits the right to vote on any basis, whether it be facial or whether it be the way the laws are written or the way they're carried out, whether it be long lines, whatever it is, anything that amounts to hindering voting, I would believe there can be legislative fixes. This is a tough question because I've read this case several times and it is back and forth. But I do believe that we need to make sure that voting is protected, because I believe that it's the voters themselves that are going to bring us out of this two-party duopoly. And a big part of that is voting for all people and bring them back to the polls. I think if you have more fair voting and people feel protected to vote, that their vote counts, whether that be because of the party structure or just the fact that they're not given the opportunity to vote. I don't support the voter ID law where in all forms. I think that it's overreaching, but this was a tough question for me because I have studied this so much that ironically it seemed that I was a little wandering on it. But I would support legislation, limited legislation at the federal level, to protect people's right to vote on any ground.
I have not read I haven't read the decision, and I'm not a lawyer, but I would absolutely want to ensure that everyone had the right to vote and had access to the right to vote. And if there were discrepancies that this Supreme Court decision is causing concerns that people aren't having access, then I would support legislation to be sure that they were able to have access to be able to vote. And but as I've mentioned, I haven't read the decision. But I do think that this is a fundamental right. I wish more people did vote. I think it's really sad that only about half the population really participates. I think I have more in common with the folks up here than the average citizen, because people seem to be really tuned out. And whatever we can do to get folks to be involved and engaged in the process, I think is important. I think one thing that we could do would be to bring civics back into our schools, because when I was in school, we had the civics course, which basically taught you your obligations as a citizen. And I think a free society, we need to be reminded that in order to preserve our freedoms, we need to be involved and engaged. And I know my mom used to say, "What have you done for your country lately?" Very much echoing what President John F. Kennedy used to say, that we have an obligation to be involved and engaged. So I think one thing that would help is to remind people in their schools is to have civics and bring that back, to remind people of their obligations to be engaged, to vote, and to be informed.
Mr. Connolly?
You know, I just finished a major civil rights archive project in conjunction with the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act. And Marion, I see in the audience, who helped us staff that, working in collaboration with George Mason University. And our own heroine, Fannie Fitzgerald, right here in Prince William County, who integrated the public school system 10 years after the Brown v. Board of Education ruling, was featured prominently in that Civil Rights Archive project. We have to move beyond platitudes. Of course, all of us think it's a good thing that people exercise their right to vote. Do you oppose the Virginia voting ID law? I do. I do. It is nothing short of voter suppression. It is designed to make sure minorities don't vote. It is designed to make sure students have a hard time voting. Students used to be able to use their student ID card, because after all, there are pictures on it. Not anymore. It's not acceptable under the new law. What in the world could the new law be designed to do but to suppress votes? It's claimed it is designed to make sure there's no voter fraud. There is no voter fraud in Virginia. Virtually none. When the Attorney General of South Carolina tried to defend his voting ID law, he was asked, name a single case in South Carolina. He couldn't name one. The problem in America is too few people vote. Not too many, and not too often. We have to make sure that we have early voting, and it's universal. We have to make sure there's same-day registration. We have to make sure that you can vote early, absentee, without an excuse. We have to make sure the polls are open weeks before the election day so everyone can vote and no one has an excuse not to. That's what we need to be doing. And unfortunately, in Virginia, the General Assembly is taking us backwards.
Mr. Galdo?
I agree that we need to do everything we can to see that every person who's eligible to vote and wants to vote can vote. And that means eliminating voter ID laws and holding every state accountable for any barriers that they establish for people being able to vote. I'm not that familiar with the court case, with the decision, but the fact of the matter is that I don't believe that there's any single piece of legislation that would address specific activities that would prevent states from finding another way to prevent some people from voting or make it more difficult for them to vote. And so we have to have probably a broader piece of legislation that establishes principles and sets up mechanisms to address issues as they arise.
Thank you. In recent years, some members of Congress have tried to eliminate all funds for Planned Parenthood, even though it provides essential basic preventive health care for many women in our area. What is your stance on funding Planned Parenthood? Did you have your first one?
I think we're back this way.
Oh, sorry. There you go.
Suzanne's.
I don't believe that I would support not funding Planned Parenthood. I think Planned Parenthood has been involved in giving people access to abortions. I don't think this is a very divisive issue, but most people agree that the government should not be providing funding that's going to be used to end human life. And so I would not support funding of Planned Parenthood.
Again, I couldn't disagree with my opponent more. Planned Parenthood is not divisive. Planned Parenthood for years has provided access for women, for health care, for breast cancer screening, and yes, for reproductive choice. My opponent is a member of the executive board of the Susan B. Anthony Fund. They are the ones promoting personhood. They are the ones promoting the defunding of Planned Parenthood. They are the ones who have even toyed with the idea of preventing access to contraception and certainly opposing a woman's right to choose. I am somebody who believes a woman knows best about her control of her own body, and that's between her and her doctor. I favor full funding of Planned Parenthood, and I voted against the proposal to defund it in Congress.
Please. Mr. Galdo.
It's an interesting issue. Okay. I would not vote to defund Planned Parenthood. Okay. I believe that any organization that provides valuable health care services should be able to do that, and if they provide a service that the federal government feels is needed, it should be funded. Personally, I don't believe in abortion in 90% of 80%, 90% of the cases that occur today, but I don't believe in interfering with a woman's right to choose, because I do not want to get government involved in something so intimate. Because down the road, if you establish personal rights for a fetus, then you open the door for a federal government to control the birth process, and I do not want to see that happen. I think that it's up to an individual. We live in a pluralistic society, and we need leadership from the top that doesn't say, hey, because I want a particular lifestyle, because I can't afford to have a child, I'm going to abort this child. We need some respect for life, and it's not only in the beginning but in the end. Euthanasia. We don't want to get into eugenics either. But I believe that we have a separation of church and state in this country, and that it's up to the individuals in government to provide personal moral leadership for the nation, and it's not the government's role to do that. Thank you.
Mr. Harold, after Mr. Harold, we're going to take a very quick break so that we can change the tape on the camera.
There is no easy answer to any question that has to do with abortion. I don't think there's an easy way to ask the questions. I certainly don't have an easy way to give any answer. I grew up Roman Catholic, and of course with that comes certain views of abortion. In the public discourse, though, I don't believe that we do have a plurality of society. And because of that, and I'm limiting this not specific to go on about specifically my views about abortion in all cases. The question is whether or not public funding should be used to Planned Parenthood. I think that this issue is contentious enough. Its issue is intimate. And because it's intimate, it should be left without any government interference. Now, my answer to this question is, and I know basically how the crowd feels about this, and probably could have taken the break first, but my answer to this question is that I don't believe, given the contentious nature of this question about abortion and the divisive nature that it plays, that government funding should be used to fund Planned Parenthood as long as they continue this activity. Now, if Planned Parenthood would separate in a way that this activity is not funded and the other activities that are not as divisive, I think there may be a way to do that. But specifically as it exists today, I would not vote to fund Planned Parenthood with public funds, federal public funds. Thank you.
Next question. Many of us commute on I-95, and it's a disaster. Metro is being extended to Dulles. What about Prince William, and is Metro in our future? And how long will that take? Ms. Schulte?
Yeah, I find that every time I go south now, I end up going east or west just to avoid 95. But yeah, I know that there's so much more that we need to be doing to address the transportation issues. It's really a quality of life that's affecting all of us. And I don't know about prediction on when Metro will be in Prince William. That I don't know the answer to that question. But I do think that the telework question that was asked earlier about how important that is to reducing the number of folks that are driving. I think that telework we need to be doing more of that. And I know I didn't answer the question quite the way you wanted, because I thought you were talking about waste in government. But I don't have a prediction on whether that when that Metro would come to Prince William, but I can tell you that I would be a strong supporter of transportation options and funding. I think one of the things that we really need to do, and I know President Obama has been talking about this, and I totally agree with him, is we need to be doing more investment in our infrastructure in general, because our highways and bridges, there's so much that needs to be done to improve our highways and bridges. So I'd be a big supporter in using federal funds to be able to support improving our roads overall, because that's a very important function of the federal government. But I can't give you a prediction on when the Metro will be in Prince William, though.
Mr. Connolly?
You know, I was intimately involved in the Silver Line, and I can tell you it took 52 years from the idea to cutting the ribbon. That's too long for Prince William County. That's why I've introduced legislation. It sounds like my opponent's going to support it, and I welcome your support, to look at the feasibility of 4 extensions into Prince William County. We've got to look at Route 1. We've got to look at Potomac Mills. We've got to look at I-66 down the median to Gainesville. Those things would make huge differences in creating choices for our citizens. Maybe not all of that's feasible. Maybe we'll decide, you know what, light rail makes more sense, or bus rapid transit makes more sense. We will never know if we don't study it now. You've got to look at the feasibility. That's why I would have the federal government undertake that feasibility, and I am very pleased that the Prince William County Chamber, a very bipartisan group, has endorsed my legislation. And it is my hope that someday this Congress, which has been so anti-infrastructure, will finally wake up and realize we need to reinvest in ourselves. Certainly we know that here in Prince William County. So I am absolutely committed to a very active engagement on the option of transit while we're looking at other investments as well. You know, we are building hot lanes on I-95, which I hope will make a difference. But I believe in the long run, we have to have transit in our future. Or as I said at the very beginning of this program tonight, we will be drowning in traffic in 20 years. We've got to have some vision, not only for ourselves, but for our children and their children.
Mr. Galdo?
I'm a city boy. I was born in the inner city in Philadelphia, and we later on moved into the suburbs. And I spent 4 years at college in New York City, in the Bronx, at Fordham, okay, before I came to Virginia to go to grad school at UVA. I lived in environments where people depend on public transportation, and it's great, because you don't need a car. You can get anywhere on public transportation. Where we lived in Philadelphia, when I was 5, 6 years old, my mother would walk a couple of blocks down to the Elevated, and we'd go downtown and shop at the department stores, Gimbel's, Wanamaker's, Strawbridge and Clothier, you know, great old, huge, you know, department stores that had everything and anything in 6 stories of merchandise. But we need a higher priority in federal government for public transportation. Not just rail, not just light rail, but buses and all forms of public transportation. We need a more vital railroad system, passenger system across this country. When I try to travel to the Green Party convention in Iowa, I couldn't find a train or a bus to get me there. Okay, that's crazy, okay? And it wasn't a small village, I mean, it was a major city. Here in Fairfax County, we are probably 10 years behind in our infrastructure, in our public transportation, behind development. Okay, we've developed too quickly in this county, and now our roads are clogged, and we just can't shift people to public transportation for all their transportation needs because the system's not there. And you can't argue in Congress that we're special, so we need funding for the Silver Line or for an extension to Prince William County, when a congressman from New Jersey says, I need money too for my system. You just have to say, yes, we all need money for our public transportation, and we need to raise the priority in spending. Thank you.
I gave some thought early on to being the pro-traffic candidate, and it didn't poll well at all. Yeah, there are some things we're going to agree on, and one of those is going to be obviously the congestion, the traffic in Northern Virginia. When I came up here, I hit my GPS coming from Fairfax Corner. It immediately told me if I didn't take Chain Bridge instead of coming 95 or some other ways, I was going to hit a 40-minute delay, and it's not even a 40-minute drive on paper. I do believe the one thing here I would say is that we are at the study stages. I don't think this should be a situation where we go blindly forward, but I do believe we need to study it. I think that the metro will eventually extend out to Prince William. I don't think there's any real question about that. But I would say that we need to do it in a way that it's not one more government program with total government oversight of every facet of it. It is something that can stimulate the economy, and a large portion of it, as we've seen in other places with the lanes and some of the tolls, that sort of thing, where it is in private hands. But I don't think that there's anyone who, and I think teleworking will help. But I do believe we're really going to have to study this. What I would caution against is just blindly going forward. I think, as the Congressman said, it's something that has to be studied. I would encourage that it not all be government operated and government regulated. I do think that a large portion of this in private hands can be done more effectively and more cost effective. So there may be different ways that we all have of getting to the goal, but at least specifically talking about Northern Virginia, I don't think that there's any real question. At some point, I think that we will extend that infrastructure out to Prince William County. And the other thing about traffic is it's just lost time. It's not just about the fact that it's annoying. It actually stifles the economy when people are spending huge portions of their productive time, not just away from their job productivity, but away from their families, sitting in traffic. So it's an important issue. I think we all would want to get there. We may want to get there in different ways as far as how involved the government will be. But I do think that Prince William County will eventually see the expansion of that infrastructure.
Thank you. Would you support the Republican House budget plan authored by House Budget Committee Chairman Paul Ryan, which would privatize Social Security to seniors, or would you support the Democratic alternative budget which protects benefits promised to seniors?
No, there are some parts of the Paul Ryan budget that I would support, but the change on Social Security, I already mentioned before, I support what the recommendations that were made by President Obama's commission, the Simpson-Bowles Commission, for helping Social Security. I mentioned that before, which would be I do believe we need to increase the retirement age. And while we're talking about Social Security, the point I was making was that we need to get more people back to work. We need to get more people contributing to the system. That I wasn't saying that that had the sequester was cuts, that people lost jobs. There's a lot of people that are out of work. We've had a real hit to our economy, and in order to be able to sustain these programs, we have to have more people working and contributing and giving back into the government. And when you have more people working, you get more revenue from taxes. And that's what I was talking about. We've got to get more people back to work to be able to preserve Social Security. So back on the question, there are some parts of the Paul Ryan budget I agree with, but I do believe there's other ways to reform Social Security, which is what I had outlined before.
I utterly and completely reject the Ryan budget. It would be ruinous for America, and it would be ruinous for senior citizens. It voucherizes Medicare. Anyone 55 years or younger would go out in the marketplace with a voucher to try to buy health insurance. Now, my opponent would repeal Obamacare. One of the good things about Obamacare is it makes it illegal to deny you health insurance based on a pre-existing condition. Now, if the Ryan budget were in effect, and if my opponent got her way in repealing Obamacare, if you're 55, you get your voucher, you got diabetes, and good luck in getting anyone to insure you. And that voucher decreases in value every year. It doesn't keep up with health insurance inflation. Now, what is the Ryan budget all about? My opponent just talked about, well, if more people are working, Social Security does better. Not under Paul Ryan. Ryan cuts over 10 years, $5.5 trillion with a T dollars in domestic discretionary spending and investments. And what does he do with it? Does he pay down the debt? No. Does he give it to Social Security to make sure it's solvent for future generations? No. He gives another tax cut, largely distorted in favor of the well-off. That is not sound public policy, and that's why I'm proud to have voted 4 times against the Paul Ryan budget.
Mr. Galdo?
I'm going to focus on Social Security. I do not believe in privatizing Social Security. If you want a guaranteed well, it's not a retirement plan. Social Security is not a retirement plan. It's a safety blanket. But if you want that safety blanket to be there, you do not want to privatize Social Security. Where are you going to put the money? You're going to invest it in the stock market? Stock market is a crapshoot. It's a gambling hall. I've invested in stocks since I was in my 20s. And I have to tell you that the odds are stacked against you. If the last couple of stock market crashes, one in 2000 and the one in 2007, don't bring home the concept that your savings are not safe in the stock market. Nothing will. I invest in the stock market, but I only invest what I can afford to lose. You can't afford to lose your life savings. You can't afford to lose your security blanket for retirement. And so this is the most absurd proposal that I have ever seen on any issue. Thank you.
I wouldn't support any part of any bill that doesn't keep promises. Again, I believe that transparency and predictability, one of the large reasons, the major reasons, the people, I own a small business, this is meandering a little bit, you just don't know what's going to happen next. You don't know what's going to happen when you hire someone. You don't know what's going to happen with taxes the next year. And that, not being able to predict what's going to happen, and it's not predictable when you don't keep promises. So I would reject any part of the budget or any part of a plan that doesn't keep promises to people that have already paid into the system. You cannot, I don't believe you can move the goalposts around later. That being said, I do believe that we need to move to I think the idea that you, in all cases, have to protect people from themselves with this safety net, I understand the rationale, but I believe that people who pay into a system should have more control over that money. If they choose to go with a program that's more privatized, I think they should have the right to do that. And sometimes the government has to, not just that they let people fail, but give people those choices. I do believe in some privatization programs within Social Security, but I wouldn't support any part of the budget that has to do with not keeping promises have already been made. One question that we're begging, though, when we talk about this budget or that budget, I certainly believe that the federal government, one of the core things it needs to do is pass budgets and not continuing resolutions. So whatever that takes, I understand it's divisive and all that. I believe that getting third-party candidates elected and into that mix may help to some degree, who they caucus with both parties at times, to break that logjam. But I will say, as the general question, and it's not specific to Social Security, this idea that nothing is allowed to go. A family can't operate without a good budget. A business can't operate without a good budget. The American people have to elect people who are committed to passing budgets, and if they don't pass budgets or won't pass budgets, the voters need to get new people in there, because passing budgets is a core part of the Congress. They need to do that. This continuing resolution, and we can blame whoever you blame for that, it gives us unpredictability and instability. People can't run their businesses, predict what's going to happen in the future.
Next question. ISIS is in Iraq. What is your plan? Mr. Connolly?
You know, the president had a lot of critics, including John McCain and Lindsey Graham, about a year and a half ago, saying that he should be arming the rebels in Syria. My view about that was, when you can show me who's wearing the white hat and who's wearing the black hat, I'll go for all the white hats. We'll train and equip and arm those folks. But can you tell who's wearing a white hat or a black hat in Syria? Well, it turns out the very people they wanted to train and equip formed something called ISIL. Not ISIS, if you will. We would have trained and equipped the very barbaric, extreme jihadists who are now known as ISIS, who are ravaging parts of Iraq and Syria. We don't have good choices in the Middle East. We don't have a lot of leverage, frankly, in the Middle East. The president has been supported by a bipartisan coalition, including the Republican leadership, on a very limited program. Airstrikes to try to throw back ISIS's gains militarily and prevent them from gaining additional ones, and a very modest training program to try to find moderate, secular-oriented insurgents in Syria who can go back in and try to turn the tide. I will be honest with you, as somebody who has spent 40 years of his life in foreign policy, I wish the president success. I am skeptical that the United States policy will succeed, because those two things alone are not going to destroy ISIS. It is too formidable a force. So we're going to have to stay vigilant. We're going to have to build alliances. We're going to have to work with other countries in the region, because after all, if we have something at stake, they have everything at stake. And we are doing that. But progress is going to be slow, and it's going to be some time. This is not going to be settled overnight.
Mr. Galdo?
I think we made a mistake. We shouldn't be there. Okay. Experts have said that the threat from ISIS, the immediate threat from ISIS, has been overblown. The administration has admitted that they're not an immediate threat to the United States. The situation is so complex in Syria and Iran, as our congressman has said, we don't know who the enemy is and who our friends are. We should just stay out. The Europeans, our European allies, won't engage with us in bombing Syria because it's illegal, according to international law. It's an act of war against Syria, who said we should stay out. The rebels don't want us bombing ISIS because their most important goal is to topple Assad. Okay, so who are we helping and who are we fighting against? It's really unclear. The president was correct months ago when he said we shouldn't go into Iraq because there's no chance of winning there unless the government becomes more inclusive and there's a more cohesive unity between the Kurds and the Shiites and the Sunnis. If we eliminate ISIS, another extremist group will just fill the vacuum that we leave behind, just as, after the Iraq War. Nothing will change when we leave. The fact is that our allies that President Obama is so proud to stand shoulder to shoulder with, Saudi Arabia funded al-Qaeda. There's evidence that the Saudi embassy was involved, personnel in the Saudi embassy was involved in providing funds to some of the terrorists that actually carried out the 9/11 attack. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, and United Arab Emirates funded ISIL in the beginning and helped them get started and brought them to where they are now. Thank you.
Mr. Harold?
I think we made a mistake, and before that, we made a mistake, and before that, we made a mistake, and then there was the mistake before that. Our foreign policy fits squarely into the we never learn category. If you look back, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Charlie Wilson's War. When the first time you watched it, I bet you thought, how heroic. And he thought he was doing the right thing. But when you watch it in retrospect, the Stinger missiles, the hands that they went into, who was the enemy then, who's the enemy now, you start to look at it differently. I believe you can look, the last 4 presidents have done a television address to the nation talking about bombing Iraq. In this case, we're going to hear a lot of things. You're going to hear that if we don't lead, nobody will. Well, then we need to examine that. We're not going to end up leading. What you're going to hear is every one of those speeches says pretty much the same thing. We're going to lead a broad-based coalition. No, we won't. In the end, we'll be in there alone. We're not going to put boots on the ground. Well, before Secretary Kerry was even back, there was already sort of floating that trial balloon from upper military brass saying we might have to. Okay? At some point, President Obama is going to say, well, I have to listen to my generals and admirals in the field, and then we are going to put boots on the ground would be my guess. It's not going to make a difference because we've seen this before. What is it that thinks this time is going to be different? We're going to leave and a new enemy will rise up. I believe that the Department of Defense should be the Department of only defense. I agree with Joe. At this point, the experts are saying there's no imminent threat. I think we get the best security through focusing on defense. And I don't believe that we'll see anything different here. I think the business of America used to be business. Now the business of America is government and war. And this perpetuates for a lot of reasons, and one of the large ones is money. Does that mean there's no dangers out there? No, I'm not an isolationist, but I am a non-interventionalist. I think we're going to see in the long run that in the next election, 2 elections from now, somebody's going to stand up and say, we made a mistake in 2014, and before that, and before that. And we're going to layer our mistakes, and we never seem to learn anything. Oh, sorry.
Ms. Schulte?
Well, I know this is going to be controversial to say this, but whether we should have been in Iraq or not is one argument we can have. But the fact that we were there, we shouldn't have left. We should have made sure that country was secure. It was secure at the time. But, we're still in Japan, we're still in Korea, we're still in Germany. After all the blood and treasure that we sacrificed, that the Iraqis sacrificed, we've lost all those gains, and I think we never should have left until the country had more of a time to become stable. And I do blame al-Maliki and the president, our president, for that. But what do we do now? I am concerned that this is going to be a protracted conflict. I think, for number one, I agree with what the president is doing with the bombing campaign. It needs to be stepped up. We need to protect the people that are going to get wiped out unless we're there, because we're the only ones that have the kind of air power to protect those populations, number one. Number two, we need to be arming the Kurds and doing whatever we can to help those people that are our allies. But we also need, I think the congressman, and I think Joe mentioned this as well, we've got to put pressure on these countries that have so much to lose from ISIL as well. It's Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Jordan, all those countries in the region need to be doing more to step up, and as President Obama has called on them to do, so that we don't have to commit ground troops. And I'm very concerned that we may have to eventually do that, but I would certainly want to do everything we can to avoid that by putting the stakeholders in that region on task to be involved in stopping this conflict. But we do have to do everything we can with the air power that the president's been doing.
Okay. Where do you stand on immigration reform? Mr. Galdo?
Okay. I support the DREAM Act. I support giving permanent residence to undocumented immigrants who meet certain criteria. But I don't think we have a major immigration problem per se. What we have is a drug problem. Okay. The thousands, tens of thousands of people that cross the border from Mexico and Central America are fleeing violence and poverty. mostly violence. Okay, violence is that is so severe that mothers are willing to send their children, thousands of miles to cross into the United States with a stranger. Okay. In order to solve the immigration problem that we have, okay, we need to solve the drug problem. We have a war on drugs that for the last 40 years has not solved the problem, and the drug problem has only gotten worse. Okay. First thing we need to do is legalize marijuana at the federal level. Okay, eliminate that market for the drug cartels. But more than that, because states are beginning to diverge from the federal policy, and we need to allow states to experiment and carry out policies that they want to do in this area. Second thing is we get away from the drug war as it is now, break up the DEA and put its responsibilities back where they were before. And we can handle drug smuggling with customs and the FBI. Okay, we don't need DEA, and the power to regulate drugs should go over to the FDA. Okay, it's not legalizing all drugs; it's controlling them and taking the market and the funding and the billions of dollars that the drug cartels get out of our market in the United States.
Thank you. Mr. Howard?
This is obvious. This is what I do for a living, deportation defense. It's 85% of my practice. I think it's to mischaracterize it a little bit to say that we have an immigration problem in this country. We have immigration challenges, we have logistical challenges and law enforcement challenges. But immigration by and large is not a problem, it's an opportunity. Other countries who want to stimulate their economy at both the top and the bottom of the skill spectrum would really like if more and more people wanted to come there. We need people to come here. Americans are not having as many children as they used to. There are demographics of the future. This is not a problem. It's an opportunity for this country that we need to deal with and deal with those challenges. People are fleeing bad situations. They are. I go to asylum court all the time. People are coming from Central America. They are fleeing that. And like Joe said, there really are people, and I know nobody can really understand it, a mother who would actually give her son or daughter to a coyote to be smuggled to America. It really is that bad. I think we have to focus more on open markets than closed borders. I do believe, and this is after working for Homeland Security and law enforcement career, that if you get a 50-foot fence, you're going to find a 51-foot ladder. I do believe that. I think the information and security are not always physical barriers. Now, do we need more information? Yes. If we had vibrant guest worker programs, if there was a way for people to come and go from this country, they would come through a port of entry. All right? I'm an American citizen. I still have to go to a port of entry and ask for admission. They're going to let me in. But if we focused on a secure information border instead of fences and people were encouraged to come through those ports of entries, we would be able to focus on anyone who came any other way. If there's a good way to come legally, anyone who comes illegally without the information we need, they're a priority for law enforcement. Again, it's about law enforcement focus. I don't have the time to talk about it. I think if we end the drug war as we now have it, we will see border violence decrease exponentially. But immigration is a challenge. Law enforcement, logistics, information, but it's not a problem, it's an opportunity.
Shelby?
Well, I think we need to take a more balanced approach, and it's one example of the failure of the two parties to work together for a solution on this, because it's become such a partisan issue. But I do believe that, first of all, we need to have a generous guest worker program. Most of the people that are coming here, they're coming here to work. We need to get folks out of the shadows and give them an opportunity to be here legally. We need to, and according to the Pew studies on this, 60% of them want to work. For the 40% that want to eventually have citizenship, I believe, need to go through the process that others have to become American citizens. In other words, they shouldn't be rewarded for breaking our laws. So, generous guest worker program, we do need to secure our borders. It is possible to secure our borders, and we absolutely need to do that for a whole host of reasons. You cannot have a society have open borders in a generous welfare state and expect your country to survive. It's a national sovereignty issue. But we also see this as a place where trafficking, drug smuggling is happening, and this is also a place where there's reporting that terrorists have been able to cross the border as well. We have got to secure our borders. But in addition, these young children that are being sent across the border, being brought up here by coyotes, this is a cry for help. We should see this to understand that there are our fellow neighbors to the south of us, that they have given up so much hope and that their children will be able to do well in their countries because of these drug cartels. That we need to be doing a number of things to help those countries. Number one, we need to be helping them with fighting these drug cartels. I don't think legalizing drugs is the answer, but to use the technologies that we have to create safe cities, number one. Number two, to also encourage businesses to invest in these countries and also get our faith-based programs, faith-based organizations to do more to help these countries. Because this is a problem that's going to be ongoing if we don't start to address why people are so desperate they're doing this.
Mr. Connolly?
Well, I favor comprehensive immigration reform legislation, and my opponent just said it's too bad the two parties can't come together. Well, actually, they did in the U.S. Senate. There was broad bipartisan support for comprehensive immigration reform. It was unfortunately the Republican leadership in the House that blocked it and has refused to consider that legislation, even in a free vote. It was that leadership that opposed the DREAM Act. I proudly voted for the DREAM Act. How can we ask innocent children to pay the price of decisions made by their parents? If you came into this country with your parents at the age of 2 or 3, and you've lived here all of your life since, and you did well in school, and you'd like the opportunity to advance and contribute to your now adopted country, are we really going to penalize those kids? Is that smart public policy? I don't think so. My opponent mentioned guest workers, and I'm sure in other parts of the country that may make sense. But what we need here is to regularize the status of people who are now undocumented, almost half of whom came to this country legally. But the system's so complicated and frankly so unpredictable that they allowed their visas to expire, now making them illegal. But we have a high-tech problem that has to be fixed. We don't have enough high-tech skilled workers. And so increasing that part of the immigration program so that we can bring in more skilled workers, the next Einstein, the next Marconi, both of whom, last time I checked, were immigrants and who helped build America and make it stronger. We need humane, comprehensive, fair, transparent, and accountable immigration reform.
We've come to the end of our Q&A.
No.
No more time. Please give the candidates a hand for participating and answering all the questions.